Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David W. Blight. Picture yourself at 16 years old. But this isn't anything like the life of a teenager today. You're not a person. You're property. A thing. Your back is a landscape of scars from beatings you've stopped counting. For the past year, you've been under the thumb of a man called a slave breaker. Someone whose entire job is to crush your spirit so thoroughly that you forget what it even means to be human. And here's the terrifying part. He's actually done it. You're broken. Body, soul, spirit, all of it. Your mind, once hungry and curious, has gone dark. That desire to read, to learn, to become something, gone. You look at the animals grazing in the fields, and you envy them, because at least they don't have to think about how wretched their existence is. You've become, in your own haunting words, a brute. Then, one day, after another vicious beating, something inside you breaks in a completely different way. The man comes at you again, but this time, you don't flinch. You fight back. For 2 brutal hours, you and this so-called slave breaker are locked in a desperate struggle in a dusty barnyard. He's a grown man, with years of violence behind him, but you're fueled by a year of bottled rage and a lifetime of injustice. You grab him by the throat, and for the first time ever, you see fear flash in his eyes. When it's over, you're bruised and bleeding, but you're not defeated. Actually, you feel something you haven't felt in forever. You feel alive. You said of that moment, "I was nothing before. I was a man now." That young man was Frederick Bailey, who the world would come to know as Frederick Douglass. And his story, this incredible journey from the absolute depths of slavery to becoming one of the most famous and influential figures of the 19th century, isn't just some dusty history lesson. It's a blueprint for what it means to create yourself, to discover your voice, and to fight for a meaningful life when everything is stacked against you. Today, we're diving into the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by historian David W. Blight. This isn't just a book. It's an epic that took Blight nearly a decade to write. He doesn't just tell us what Douglass did. He takes us inside his mind, his heart, his soul. Here's my promise to you. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the secret to Douglass's power. It wasn't just his brilliance or his bravery. It was his profound understanding of how to wield words as weapons, how to transform pain into purpose, and how to become a prophet who didn't just see the future, but actually bent it to his will. This is the story of how a man who wasn't even supposed to learn the alphabet ended up writing his name across the pages of history. To truly understand Frederick Douglass, you have to start in complete darkness. You have to grasp what he came from. He was born into a world meticulously designed to erase him, to render him invisible, to deny his very humanity. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in 1818, on a desolate plantation on Maryland's eastern shore. He never knew his birthday. He said that genealogical trees do not flourish among slaves. Let that sink in for a moment. Not knowing when you were born. It's like starting life without a beginning, without an anchor in time. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was essentially a stranger to him. She worked on a farm 12 miles away, and he remembered her visiting only a handful of times, walking all that distance in the dead of night, just to hold him for a few precious hours before she had to be back in the fields by sunrise. He last saw her when he was about 7. She died shortly after, and he wasn't even allowed to attend her burial. He wrote, "Slavery had made my mother who bore me into a myth." And his father, he never knew for certain, but it was an open secret that his father was a white man, quite possibly his own master, Aaron Anthony. This was the twisted, perverse reality of slavery. a system where a man could literally own his own child as property. Douglass later wrote about this with cold fury. A man who will enslave his own blood may not be safely relied on for magnanimity. There was no love there, only power and shame. So from the very beginning, he was an orphan, a boy without family, without history, without even a name that was truly his own. His first real home was the small cabin of his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. She was his one constant in those early years, a strong, loving woman. But when he was just 6 years old, she walked him 12 miles through the woods to the main plantation, the great house farm of Colonel Lloyd. It was a place of shocking contrasts. On one hand, it had what Douglass called Eden-like beauty, with sprawling fields and a grand mansion. But it was also a theater of unimaginable cruelty. It was here that the young boy witnessed the true face of slavery. One morning he was jolted awake by horrific screams. Peeking through the cracks of a closet, he saw his own master, Aaron Anthony, whipping his young Aunt Hester, who was stripped to the waist and tied to a beam. The man beat her until her back was a mess of blood, all because she dared to meet with a young man she loved. Douglass said that morning was his, quote, entrance into the hell of slavery. He was only 6 or 7 years old. He witnessed overseers who were cold, calculated tyrants. He tells the story of an overseer named Gore, who shot a slave named Denby in the face for refusing to come out of a creek after being whipped. There was no trial, no consequences. A slave's life had no value whatsoever. This world was specifically designed to break him, to turn him into a brute, just another piece of property. He was cold, hungry, dressed in nothing but a rough linen shirt. He ate cornmeal mush out of a trough, like livestock. He wrote that in winter, his feet were so cracked with frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. But then something happened. A stroke of luck, or perhaps destiny intervening. When he was about 8 years old, he was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, relatives of his master, and in Baltimore his entire universe shifted. For the first time in his life he encountered a white person who treated him with genuine kindness. Sophia Auld had never owned a slave before, and she didn't know the rules. She saw a curious, bright-eyed little boy, and her maternal instincts kicked in. She began teaching him his ABCs. For Douglass, this was like a door swinging open to a universe he never knew existed. He was a ravenous student, hungry for every letter, every word. But when her husband, Hugh Auld, discovered what she was doing, he was furious. He forbade her from teaching the boy anything more. And what he said in that moment became the pivotal turning point in Frederick Douglass's entire life. Douglass overheard him declare that teaching a slave to read was unlawful and dangerous. "If you teach that nigger how to read," Auld said, "there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave." And right there the young boy had a revelation, a lightning bolt of understanding. Hugh Auld had accidentally handed him the master key to his own liberation. From that moment, Douglass wrote, "I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. If knowledge could make him unfit to be a slave, then knowledge was the one thing he absolutely had to acquire. It became his obsession, his mission, his lifeline." Sophia Auld, under her husband's strict orders, transformed from a kind teacher into a harsh guard. She would snatch any book or newspaper from his hands. But it was too late. The fire had been lit. Douglass wrote that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. Their home became a battlefield, a silent war between a mistress trying to enforce ignorance and a young boy determined to steal knowledge at any cost. He became incredibly clever. He started carrying a Webster's spelling book with him everywhere. When he was sent on errands around Baltimore, He befriended poor white boys in the neighborhood. He'd challenge them, saying he could write letters as well as they could. They didn't believe him, so he'd get them to teach him new letters. And how did he pay his young tutors? With bread. He'd trade biscuits from the old kitchen for lessons in literacy. The streets of Baltimore became his classroom. The pavement became his chalkboard. Then, at 12 years old, he took 50 cents he'd earned from odd jobs and bought his own copy of a book called the Columbian Orator. This book would become his Bible, his constant companion, practically worn through from reading. It was a collection of speeches about liberty, freedom, and human rights. He read about great orators like Cicero and Sheridan. He read a powerful dialogue between a master and a slave, where the slave, through sheer force of argument, actually convinces his master to set him free. This book gave him language for the fire burning inside him. He started to understand not just that slavery was wrong, but why it was morally indefensible. He learned about natural rights and justice. He wrote that reading this book poured floods of light on the nature and character of slavery. But this newfound knowledge was a double-edged sword, both a gift and a curse. The more he read, the more he loathed his condition. He said the knowledge stung me and made me gloomy and miserable. He looked at his fellow slaves, who didn't carry this torment of consciousness, and he almost envied their ignorance. He wrote, "I have often wished myself a beast, anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking." But there was no going back. He said that the silver trump of freedom had aroused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom was no longer some abstract concept. It was a constant, tormenting presence. It was in every ray of sunlight, in every whisper of wind, in the sight of beautiful ships sailing out of Baltimore Harbor. Those ships, he wrote, were so many shrouded ghosts to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. He would stand on the shore and speak to them, a lonely boy pouring out his soul's deepest complaints. "You are loosed from your moorings, and are free," he would say. "I am fast in my chains, and am a slave. Oh, that I were free! Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks!" This growing knowledge and hunger for freedom made him a troublesome slave. And so, in 1833, when he was around 15, his master sent him back to the eastern shore to be broken. He was sent to live with a man named Edward Covey, a poor farmer with a notorious reputation as a, quote, "nigger breaker." For 1 year, Douglass was plunged back into the deepest hell of slavery. He became a field hand, forced into back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk. Covey was a sadistic, cunning tyrant who seemed to genuinely enjoy the cruelty. Douglass said Covey was like a snake, always hiding, watching, waiting for any excuse to inflict pain. And he whipped him constantly. In the first week alone, Douglass was beaten so severely his back was raw meat. The physical pain was immense, but the psychological toll was even worse. Covey's goal was to extinguish the spark of humanity that had been ignited in Baltimore. And for a terrifying time, he succeeded. Douglass wrote, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. Behold a man transformed into a brute. He lost the will to read, the will to hope, even the will to live. He was just a body, just an animal, doing his master's bidding." This was the absolute lowest point of his life. But then came that day in the barnyard. It was a scorching August day, and Douglass collapsed from heat exhaustion while working in the fields. Covey found him, kicked him viciously in the ribs, and beat him with a hickory stick. Something in Douglass broke, but this time it wasn't his spirit. It was the last chain of fear that had held him in submission. He ran away briefly, but eventually returned, knowing a confrontation was inevitable. The next morning, Covey came for him in the stable, ready to tie him up for another whipping. And Frederick Douglass fought back. The fight lasted what he remembered as 2 hours. It was brutal, desperate, primal. Covey was a strong man, but Douglass was now a powerful teenager, filled with righteous fury. He refused to be whipped. He grabbed Covey by the throat, and the so-called nigger breaker was broken himself. Covey never laid a hand on him again for the rest of the year. That fight was more than just a physical victory. It was a spiritual resurrection. Douglass said it recalled to life my crushed self-respect and my departed manhood. He walked away from that fight a completely different person. The brute was gone, the man was back. And that man was now determined to be free. After his year with Covey, he was hired out to another farmer, William Freeland. Here, he found a small community of fellow slaves who looked up to him because of his literacy. And in the woods behind the barn, Frederick Douglass discovered his first real calling. He started a secret Sunday school, teaching his friends to read and write using the Bible and his treasured Columbian orator. "These were great days to my soul," he wrote. He was no longer just a slave. He was a leader, a teacher, a beacon of hope. And it was with this band of brothers that he hatched his first serious escape plot. They planned to steal a canoe and row their way up the Chesapeake Bay to freedom in Pennsylvania. Douglass, using the writing skills he'd so painstakingly acquired, forged passes for each of them. But their plan was betrayed. On the morning of their planned escape, they were surrounded by constables, tied up, and marched 15 miles to the county jail. Douglass, as the ringleader, was certain he'd be sold to the Deep South, a fate worse than death. He was separated from his friends and left alone in a stone cell, with slave traders coming to inspect him like a piece of livestock. But then, another stroke of luck. His master, Thomas Auld, for reasons Douglass never fully understood, decided not to sell him. Perhaps it was a flicker of conscience, or maybe he just didn't want the hassle. Instead, he sent him back to Baltimore. He was being given a second chance, and he knew he wouldn't waste it. He returned to Baltimore a changed man. He was now 20 years old, physically powerful, and mentally fortified by everything he'd endured. He went to work in the shipyards as a caulker, a skilled trade. But the shipyards were dangerous, full of racial tension. He was constantly harassed by white apprentices who feared that black workers were stealing their jobs. After being brutally beaten by 4 men, he learned another hard lesson. The law wouldn't protect him. A black man couldn't testify against a white man in court. But in the midst of this, he found community. He joined the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, a debating club for free black men. Here, he could sharpen his mind and his voice, debating the great issues of the day. And it was here that he met Anna Murray. Anna was a free black woman, 5 years older than him. She was steady, hard-working, and deeply supportive. She saw the fire in this young, brilliant slave, and she believed in him. They fell in love and began planning a life together, a life in freedom. Anna used her own savings to help fund his escape. Douglass knew he couldn't wait for his master to grant him freedom. He had to seize it. So on September 3, 1838, dressed as a sailor and carrying a sailor's protection paper borrowed from a free black friend, Frederick Bailey boarded a train heading north. The journey was absolutely terrifying. Every single moment was fraught with danger. On the train, the conductor came to check his papers. The description on the paper didn't match him at all. His heart hammered in his chest. But the conductor, in a hurry, only gave it a quick glance and moved on. Douglass had survived his first test. He traveled by train, by steamboat, by ferry, constantly on edge, trusting no one. He finally arrived in New York City, a free man, but he was completely alone in a strange city, with slave catchers lurking everywhere. He later wrote about the profound loneliness of that moment. I was a stranger in a strange land. He was saved by David Ruggles, a black abolitionist who ran a vigilance committee that helped fugitive slaves. Ruggles took him in, gave him shelter, and most importantly, sent for Anna. Anna Murray traveled from Baltimore to New York, and just days after her arrival, on September 15, 1838, they were married. A fugitive slave himself, the Reverend James W.C. Pennington, performed the ceremony. But they weren't safe yet. Ruggles advised them to keep moving, to go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling port with a large community of free blacks and Quakers. He gave them $5 and a new name. His old name Bailey was too dangerous. Ruggles had been reading Sir Walter Scott's poem, Lady of the Lake, and suggested the name Douglass. And so Frederick Bailey died, and Frederick Douglass was born. In New Bedford, for the first time in his life, he felt the genuine thrill of being his own master. He worked as a day laborer, shoveling coal, loading ships, doing whatever he could to support his growing family. Anna gave birth to their first child, Rosetta, in 1839, and their son Louis in 1840. Life was hard, but it was a life of freedom. And then he discovered The Liberator. The Liberator was William Lloyd Garrison's radical abolitionist newspaper. Reading it, Douglass said, set his soul on fire. He'd found his cause. He'd found his people. The paper became his meat and drink. He started attending abolitionist meetings, listening, learning, and finally, speaking. In August 1841, he attended an anti-slavery convention on Nantucket Island. A friend who knew his story urged him to speak. Douglass was terrified. He'd never spoken to a white audience before. But he stood up, and with a trembling voice, he began to tell his story, and he held the audience completely captive. William Lloyd Garrison was in the crowd that day. He was mesmerized. I shall never forget his first speech, Garrison later wrote. The powerful impression it created. I think I never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. That speech launched his career. He was hired as a full-time lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. For the next several years, he traveled relentlessly, telling his story, bearing witness to slavery's horrors. He was a sensation. He was tall, handsome, with a powerful, resonant voice. But more than that, he was living proof that the racist stereotypes about black inferiority were complete lies. He was a graduate of what he called the, quote, peculiar institution, and he had a Ph.D. in its cruelty. But his eloquence became a problem. Some people started doubting his story. He doesn't talk like a slave, they whispered. He's too articulate, too educated. They thought he was an imposter. So in 1845, he made a dangerous decision. He decided to write his story down, to put it all in a book, including the real names of people and places. He wrote Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. The book was an instant bestseller, selling 5,000 copies in just a few months, but it also put his life in serious jeopardy. He'd exposed himself. Now any slave catcher could identify him and drag him back to Maryland. So his abolitionist friends urged him to leave the country. He sailed to Ireland and Great Britain, where he spent 2 years, and in Europe he was transformed. For the first time he felt what it was like to be treated not as a color, but as a man. He could travel freely, stay in the same hotels, eat at the same tables as whites. He wrote, I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. He became an international celebrity. He spoke to massive crowds, raising awareness and money for the abolitionist cause. And while he was there, his British friends did something extraordinary. They raised the money to purchase his freedom. In 1846, Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave, became legally a free man. He returned to America in 1847, not just as a lecturer, but as a leader in his own right, and he had a new plan. He wanted to start his own newspaper. This was a major turning point. His white abolitionist friends, including Garrison, were against it. They wanted him to stick to telling his story. They worried he would fail. But Douglass knew he needed his own voice, an independent platform to speak for his people. So he moved his family to Rochester, New York, and in December 1847, he published the first issue of the North Star. Its motto was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and all we are brethren." The newspaper became his best school. It forced him to read, to think, to engage with every major issue of the day, from politics to women's rights. He'd been a follower of Garrison's philosophy, which rejected politics and the Constitution as hopelessly pro-slavery. But as an editor, he began to change his mind. He started to see that the Constitution, for all its flaws, could be a weapon for liberty. He began arguing that it wasn't a pro-slavery document, but an anti-slavery one. This was a radical idea, and it led to a bitter, painful break with Garrison and his old comrades. They accused him of betrayal, of being ungrateful. It was a deeply personal and public feud that lasted for years. Douglass was now an independent man, charting his own course. And that course was leading him directly into the turbulent world of politics. The 1850s were a decade of escalating crisis. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 turned the entire North into a hunting ground for slave catchers. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened the West to slavery's expansion. And the Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that a black man had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. For Douglass, these were dark, desperate times. But he refused to give up hope. He believed in what he called the stern logic of events. He believed that slaveholders, in their arrogance, would overreach and push the nation to a breaking point. And in the midst of this darkness, a new fire was kindled. His relationship with radical abolitionist John Brown is one of the most fascinating parts of his life. They were two very different men. Douglass was a man of words, a believer in political action. Brown was a man of action, a warrior who believed slavery could only be purged by blood. But they shared deep, mutual respect. Brown saw in Douglass a leader who could rally black people to his cause. Douglass saw in Brown a man willing to die for the slave. Brown came to Douglass's home in Rochester in 1858 and stayed for several weeks. It was there that he laid out his plan for a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He wanted to spark a massive slave insurrection that would spread through the South, and he wanted Douglass to join him. This was the ultimate test of Douglass's convictions. He'd preached resistance. He'd called for the blood of tyrants. But this was different. This was a direct, violent attack on the federal government. In August 1859, they met for the last time in a secret meeting at an old stone quarry. Brown made his final plea. "When I strike," he said, "the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hive them." But Douglass refused. He told Brown the raid was a, quote, "perfect steel trap." It would fail, and Brown would be killed. "I could live for the slave," Douglass later wrote. John Brown could die for the slave. Brown went ahead with the raid in October 1859, and just as Douglass predicted, it failed. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged. But in his death he became a martyr. His raid electrified the nation and pushed it to the brink of war. And Douglass, who was implicated in the raid, had to flee the country once again to avoid arrest. He returned in 1860, just as the nation was about to tear itself apart. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Douglass rejoiced. This was the war he'd been waiting for. The apocalyptic struggle he believed was necessary to destroy slavery and remake the nation. From the very beginning, he had a clear, unwavering message. This war was about slavery, and the only way to win it was to make it a war for emancipation. He pushed, he prodded, he thundered against the Lincoln administration for its cautious, hesitant approach. He called for the enlistment of black soldiers. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., he wrote, and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship. When Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Douglass called it the greatest event of our nation's history. But he knew it was just a piece of paper. It had to be made real with iron, lead, and fire. And so he became a recruiter, traveling across the North, urging black men to enlist. Among the first to sign up were his own two sons, Lewis and Charles. Douglass, the father, was sending his own children into mortal danger to fight for their people's freedom. His sons fought with the famed 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first black regiment raised in the North. And at the bloody assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863, Lewis was there, in the thick of the fight, as their white colonel Robert Gould Shaw was killed. The 54th suffered horrific casualties, but their bravery proved to a skeptical nation that black men could and would fight for their own freedom. Douglass's relationship with Abraham Lincoln is a story in itself. At first, he was a harsh critic, blasting Lincoln for his slowness, for his talk of colonization, but over time he came to see the president's deep moral core and his political genius. He met with Lincoln at the White House 3 times. Imagine that, the former slave, standing in the executive mansion, advising the most powerful man in the world. At their second meeting, in the dark summer of 1864, when the war was going badly and Lincoln feared he'd lose the election, the president asked for Douglass's help. He wanted Douglass to organize a plan to get as many slaves as possible to escape to Union lines before the election, in case he lost, and a negotiated peace left them in bondage. That meeting changed everything for Douglass. He saw that Lincoln wasn't just a politician. He was a man genuinely committed to the cause of freedom. From that day on, Douglass was a loyal supporter. When the war ended and Lincoln was assassinated, Douglass mourned him as a great and good man. But he knew the work wasn't over. The struggle for freedom had entered a new phase, Reconstruction, and in many ways, this was an even harder fight. Douglass's message was crystal clear. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. He knew that without political power, without the right to vote, the freedom of the ex-slaves would be a cruel joke. He became a powerful voice for the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and emancipation. He moved to Washington, D.C., and for the rest of his life, he was a political insider, a man with access to presidents and senators. He held several federal appointments, including Marshal of the District of Columbia and Minister to Haiti, but he never lost his radical fire. He never stopped being the prophet of freedom. In his later years, he became known as the Sage of Anacostia, the grand old man of the civil rights struggle. He lived in a beautiful house on a hill called Cedar Hill, overlooking the Capitol. But he was never content to rest on his accomplishments. He witnessed the betrayal of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, the terror of lynching, and he fought back with the one weapon he'd always trusted, his voice. He spoke out against injustice, against complacency, against the nation's forgetting of what the Civil War was truly about. He was a living monument, a constant reminder of the price of freedom. His private life was complex and often filled with sorrow. His first wife, Anna, who had been his rock for 44 years, died in 1882. She'd been the anchor of his turbulent life, the quiet center of his storm. 18 months later, he did something that shocked both the black and white worlds. He married Helen Pitts, a white woman who'd been his secretary. She was well-educated, an abolitionist and a suffragist, and she was 20 years younger than him. The marriage caused a scandal. He was condemned by many in his own race. But Douglass was defiant. He said his first wife was the color of my mother, and the second the color of my father. He spent his final years traveling, writing, and speaking. He was a born traveler, journeying through Europe and even to Egypt, marveling at the pyramids and reflecting on the ancient story of slavery and exodus. Until the very end, he was a fighter. On the last day of his life, February 20th, 1895, he attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He came home in the late afternoon, full of energy, excited about the speeches he'd heard. As he was in his front hall, demonstrating one of the speeches to his wife Helen, he collapsed and died of a massive heart attack. The prophet was silent, but his words and his story would live on forever. So what do we take away from a life as immense and powerful as Frederick Douglass's? This book, Prophet of Freedom, is more than 800 pages long, and we've only scratched the surface. But there are a few core lessons that I think are absolutely vital, especially for you right now, as you're figuring out who you are and what you want to do with your life. The first, and perhaps most important, is the incredible power of literacy. Think about it. For Douglass, learning to read wasn't some tedious chore. It wasn't something he had to do for school. It was the key that unlocked his own mind. It was the weapon he used to fight for his very soul. Hugh Auld was right. Learning to read did make him unfit to be a slave. Because once you can read, once you can access the ideas and stories of others, you can begin questioning the world you've been given. You can begin imagining a different reality. So I want you to ask yourself, what is your literacy? What is the skill, the knowledge, the thing that, if you master it, will make you unfit for an ordinary life? It might be learning to code. It might be mastering a musical instrument. It might be learning to speak publicly with confidence. Whatever it is, pursue it with the same hunger that Douglass pursued the alphabet, because that is the true source of your freedom. The second lesson is about the nature of struggle. Douglass once said something that has stayed with me for years. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. We live in a world that constantly tells us to seek comfort, to avoid difficulty. But Douglass's life teaches us the opposite. It was in the moments of greatest struggle, the fight with Covey, the terror of his escape, the constant battles against racism, that he grew the most. He didn't just endure his struggles. He used them. He transformed them into fuel. He understood that power concedes nothing without a demand. So don't be afraid of the struggles in your own life. Don't run from the things that are hard. That's where your character is forged. That's where your real progress happens. And finally, there's the lesson of voice. Douglass was, as the author calls him, a man of words. His voice was his power. But he didn't just find that voice. He built it. He built it in the streets of Baltimore, trading bread for letters. He built it reading the Columbian Orator by candlelight. He built it in secret Sunday schools, teaching his fellow slaves. He built it on thousands of lecture platforms, facing down angry mobs. He understood that having something to say isn't enough. You have to learn how to say it. You have to craft your message, sharpen your arguments, and speak with conviction that comes from the very core of your being. Your voice matters. What you have to say matters. So find your voice, and don't be afraid to use it. Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. That was a summary of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David W. Blight. We've journeyed through the major milestones of an incredible life today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a great mountain. It can show you the path, but it can never let you feel the climb, the wind on your face, the breathtaking view from the summit. The real power of this book is in the details, in the texture of Douglass's words, and the depth of the author's research. If any part of this story has sparked something in you, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about spending time with one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived, and letting his courage and wisdom seep into your own life. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring the ideas that have shaped the world's greatest minds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for us. Let's keep learning and growing together. Thank you for listening,